Hello, everybody. Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. I am Daniel Golden from Boswell, and we are thrilled on day 4,585 of us being in business to be welcoming Eddee Daniel to Boswell. We have a number of programs coming up, some in person like today's, and some virtual, and even a few at other places. So please check out our, I think that's teal calendar at the front of the store, or if you're joining us virtually, go to boswellbooks.com, and we have 2 to 3 weeks there. And if you go to the upcoming events page, it goes out even further. We are thrilled to be presenting the Milwaukee River Greenway with Eddee Daniel in conversation with John Gurda. Eddee Daniel is a Milwaukee-based writer, photographer, and arts educator, and has served on the boards of Milwaukee Riverkeeper, Friends of the Hank Aaron State Trail, and Preserve Our Parks, which he curates the Natural Well, and for which he curates the Natural Well website. John Gurda is a Milwaukee historian and author of 22 books, including The Making of Milwaukee, Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods, and Milwaukee, a City Built on Water. Just a reminder, we will be taking questions after the talk. You can either, if you're in the audience here, you can raise your hand. We'll repeat it for folks at home. And if you are at home, you can send a chat, and Rachel will raise her hand as if she is you. So with that, let's give a big hand to Eddee Daniel and John Gurda.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, John, for joining me. What Daniel didn't mention is that John is also in this book. So John graciously wrote a brilliant foreword for the book and contributed one of a number of different stories that are interspersed throughout the book. So I'm very grateful on a number of levels to have John with me tonight.
Glad to be along for the paddle, Eddie, and want to offer my thanks to Daniel as well for, in a challenging environment for independent booksellers, to be keeping the faith and making place on the east side of Milwaukee. So I think he deserves a round of applause. This is billed as a conversation, not a talk or a reading. And maybe just to kick things off, Eddie, you know, if people don't know your work, certainly you're known as a fine arts photographer, but a lot of your work is based around the idea of the urban wilderness, nature in the city. Where did that start for you? I mean, some people are out there in the West taking pictures of mountains. No, you're here taking pictures of the Menominee Valley.
Indeed. It started for me when I live in Wauwatosa, next to the Milwaukee County grounds. And what I'm doing currently grows out of an event that happened in 1997, when then County Executive Tom Ament decided to sell off the Milwaukee County grounds. Some of you may remember that episode. It had something, I won't go into all the details, but it had something to do with a pension scandal. But I decided to use my experience as a photographer. I've been a photographer, a photography teacher for a long time, but I decided to use that experience to try to help influence what the fate of the county grounds. And so I spent an entire year going out and photographing the county grounds at least once a week. And I produced a body of work, which at that time in the late 1990s was still on film. And I used slide film and was producing slides so that I could take a slideshow around town, which is a very different experience than what we are able to do today. That kind of radicalized me in a sense towards being an advocate for the environment. And I've been doing stuff like this ever since.
Had you been aware of the kind of the nature in the city before that time, or was that kind of a revelation to you?
That's a really good point. I've always been aware of nature, and I've always enjoyed being around nature. And I live next to the Menominee River Parkway. And so, yes, and in fact, I mentioned one of the stories in the book is about moving to Milwaukee and living next to the Milwaukee River and exploring the Milwaukee River Greenway immediately. So I was well aware of nature in the city, and I've always loved it.
But did that kind of open the door to you all of a sudden to say, oh, there's this whole world out there, and let's go look at it?
You know, I don't think it was an epiphany or a pivotal moment like that. The pivotal moment was the use of my photography for the advocacy work. But my interest in the environment goes back to my youth.
Okay. In upstate New York.
In just north of New York City.
Okay. You said the Delaware is kind of where you were?
I right near the Hudson River on the west side of the river.
Okay. Now, what I enjoy about your work is it's kind of a blend of aesthetics and public policy, which is kind of it's a nice spot to be in. You can be kind of abstracted and just look at things from the aesthetic point of view, but no, your point has always been look at this, and I think I've appreciated that. So why the Greenway?
Why the Greenway? Maybe to begin with, we should tell the people what the Greenway is.
How many of you have walked, hiked, or paddled the Greenway? Most of you.
Good number. So the Milwaukee Greenway, for anyone who isn't familiar with it, extends from the old North Avenue Dam, which is south of North Avenue, between North Avenue and Humboldt Street. And the dam no longer is there, but you can tell it's there because there's a pedestrian bridge at that point. It extends from there north all the way to Silver Spring Drive, a total of approximately 8 miles. And it encompasses many parks and public lands in between, all connected by the river.
And that goes back a ways, but why the 15th year anniversary, is kind of the peg for the book to rest on.
Indeed, this has been the 15th anniversary year of the founding of what's called the Milwaukee River Greenway Coalition, which, as the name implies, it's a coalition of organizations that have stewarded the river to this point and will continue to steward it into the future. And they were founded 15 years ago in an effort to create what we now call the Greenway, because that wasn't a term that was being used. But you can tell us probably better than I can some of the history behind this. The history of the Greenway actually goes back to Charles Whitnall.
Yeah, Whitnall and actually Victor Berger. How many remember that name? Victor Berger was the kind of a socialist godfather in Milwaukee. And one of the fun parts of working on the foreword for Eddie's book and later a column for the Journal Sentinel was trying to trace. I'd read over the years about Victor Berger's his $1 Million Parkway, and that was a big deal, back in 1910, 1911 to spend that much money on a public amenity. So this gave me kind of a chance to go back and do the clips and kind of trace the backstory. And kind of where it came from was 1910. The socialists, after a lot of corruption in high places in Milwaukee, the bad guys were swept out, the good guys were swept in. And you have Emil Seidel, 1910 to 1912, then Dan Hone from 16 to 40, and then Frank Zeiler from 48 to 60. So we had socialist mayors, for most of 50 years, 38 to 50 years. No one did that. No one did that in the entire country. And one of their very, very big deals, their priorities was public parks for the public good. And Charles E. Whitnall, as Eddie said, was kind of the godfather there. So if you look at the Whitnall master plan from 1923 and overlay it on the current map of the county park system, it's really close, because his sort of guiding philosophy was to hang the parks in a trellis of waterways. So Milwaukee is a city built on water. The county park system is built on water as well. So you have that being kind of the guiding principle. And what's the biggest river? What's the most important river? It's the Milwaukee. So Berger, back in 1911, before he's just about to leave for Congress as the first socialist, maybe until Bernie Sanders in Congress. So he leaves in 1911 after he's elected in that same landslide. And as almost a parting gift, he spends a whole lot of time getting easements with the help of a cooperative realtor on most of the land between around North and Hampton. And what he was after, it was not just the narrow strip along the parkway or along the river itself, but he wanted 500 acres between Oakland on the east, Humboldt on the west, and north, and Hampton. That's a lot of land, 500 acres. And $1 million price tag for that was revolutionary to some, visionary to others. It was certainly visionary in my mind. And the estimated price tag was $1 million spread over 20 years of land contracts, basically. So it was popular. Bankers liked it. Public luminaries like General MacArthur, the one we know, John, it was Douglas's grandfather, liked the idea. So there seemed to be all kinds of motion behind it. Some people on the Common Council said, no, that's too much money. You're going too fast. The public hasn't been allowed to weigh in. So they had a referendum was scheduled, and appraisal was made, and the appraisal came in at like $750,000. So it sort of deflated, the original figure. And they said, you're paying too much. So long story short, you have kind of this nibbling away at the idea. And the options expired, so did the idea, not to be revitalized, not to be renewed again until the 1990s. So it was one of those ideas of being way ahead of your time, but good ideas have a habit of surfacing sooner or later, and that was a great idea. As I said in the forward, I'm just amazed. What American city has that large an area of green space, 8 miles of river, almost 900 acres of urban wilderness, 1.5 miles from City Hall? That doesn't happen.
Absolutely. I love sharing that idea with people that we have a park, essentially. The Greenway is an extended. If you look on the map, it doesn't look as impressive because it's so strung out, but it is larger than Central Park in New York City, which is a it's a worldwide known park. And we have a park in the heart of Milwaukee, just as Central Park is in the heart of Manhattan. We have a park that's about the same size, a little bigger, that nobody's ever heard of, and has been left pretty much, relatively much of it, in a more or less natural state, instead of being completely manicured and bulldozed into submission the way Central Park was. And even people who live in Milwaukee are surprised to find it often.
I think the power there is a Central Park or Golden Gate Park or Stanley Park. They're designed. Ours is undesigned, which is, to your point, that's kind of what you made a passion and a calling for a number of years here, is kind of the survival, the resilience, the continuing presence of the natural world inside all these things we have spun around it.
Yeah, and not all of it is natural, of course. The parts that I like best are the parts that have been left a little bit untouched. But there are many parks that make up what we now call the Greenway, including Lincoln Park, which is the third largest park in the Milwaukee County Park system. And it has all kinds of traditional features for a park, like soccer fields and basketball courts and a water park, and all kinds, and a golf course. I mean, so all those traditional things in a park, but there are also sections of it that almost nobody goes to, believe it or not. And other parts of the Greenway, there's a section of the Greenway that it's called Pleasant Valley. Have you been to Pleasant Valley? So, and of course, John can tell you a little bit more about the history of Pleasant Valley. But if you go to Pleasant Valley, you have to imagine what was there at one time. So 100 years ago, Pleasant Valley was a resort, a very fancy big resort. It had a beer garden, it had a pavilion, it had a ballroom, it had cottages you could rent, bridle paths. I mean, it had all kinds of stuff. You could rent a cabin and stay there overnight. And today you can't see any of that. There's nothing left. In fact, there isn't even a sign that says you're in Pleasant Valley Park, even though it's an official county park.
And it's not even paved, is it? The path to get down there, is it?
Right.
So it's a gravel path leading down to the river. I misspoke earlier. The Burger plan was it was Locust North, not North Avenue North, because there was already Gordon was there, Kern was there, Riverside was there, 1890. So those predate, and that was kind of the foothold, for the Burger plan. But that was the Pleasant Valley was the Blatt's Brewery. There were kind of this perennial one-upmanship the part of the breweries, they all had, their own beer gardens, and Pabst had two. They had one down on Third and Garfield, now King and Garfield, and one up in Whitefish Bay, right along the lake, right just north of Henry Clay. So it was. I'm not a nostalgic person. I think history is important because it explains things. But if I could go back, that'd be one of the first places I'd stop. All the beer gardens around Milwaukee, and there were a lot of them. There were a whole lot, not just the brewery-owned beer gardens or brewery-managed or brewery-leased beer gardens, but some private ones as well. Little picnic groves over here at Lake Park began as Ludemans on the Lake. A little private picnic grove. So, and those eventually became, the spine of a world-class park system.
The thing that's a little bit hard for us to grasp and imagine is that 100 years ago and earlier, it wasn't a river. I mean, you go down and walk along the Greenway now, and it's lovely. It's a river, and it's in a valley and in the trees, and you can kind of imagine there's no city around you, which I love. But 100 years ago, it was a very long, thin lake. And in the wintertime, it froze, and thousands of people went ice skating up and down the whole length of it. And in the summertime, they boated. There were steamboats running up and down the river. We don't have the same relationship to this vast space today as people, because and you can share again a little bit more clearly the history of this. Back 100 and 150 years ago, people who lived in the city of Milwaukee were going out of town. They were going up to some not remote exactly, but a place away from the city. And it was this lovely lakeside resort area.
It was for a while. That's if you could afford it.
Yeah.
For the working stiffs, who only got Sunday off, that was, there was a real demand, real interest in recreation in town, and the river was right there, so I described it as an in town up north. Daniel was talking about the book, Milwaukee, a City Built on Water. There's a whole chapter on the in town up north, lined with canoe clubs, swimming schools, amusement parks, beer gardens. I mean, there were roller coasters and carousels and water slides. There was one on the east bank called Shoot the Chutes, just south of North Avenue, debuted in 1896 on July 4th, and it was a water slide. So you have these water toboggans that would kind of peel down this slide like a ski slide and go all the way across the river. They kind of winch them back up to the top. People had to walk. They winched the boats back up there, and it was. I quote that in the book, talking about it was popular among young men who were taking their dates there because at the first hint of danger, the young lady put her arm or her head on the guy's shoulder for safety. But that was, Wisconsin Dells has water parks. You're talking 1896. So the Upper River has a claim to being kind of the first water park in Wisconsin.
We actually have a picture of the Shoot the Chutes in the book. One of the things I've really enjoyed about putting this book together is going to the Milwaukee County Historical Society and looking for archival pictures of what things looked like and what people were doing back then, and going back to some of those same sites and showing people what they look like today. So a side-to-side comparison of a place that was a resort at one time or a factory at one time and is now a green space, a natural looking green space. In fact, one of my favorite comparisons in this vein is there was this gigantic factory that was built. It was called the National Brake and Electric Company, and it was built on the site where today there is an arboretum. And the picture of the black and white picture, archival picture, shows this massive factory. And I'm not exaggerating in massive. They built locomotives in here, and they built tanks for World War I and all kinds of material such as that. And nothing is left. There's one building left, but this massive factory was for 70 years. It went out of business in the 30s, and it wasn't entirely due to the Depression. There were some other issues around that, but for 70 years, that land was just a field of rubble. And then the River Revitalization Foundation and the Urban Ecology Center, which is located right there next to Riverside Park and next to this new arboretum, they had this vision of reclaiming this land, reconstituting it, rehabilitating it, and making it into a beautiful natural area, and proceeded to do just that.
And the point there for me is that nothing had to happen. This was not an inevitable development of the Greenway today. And one of Victor Berger's motivations in putting together the plan for that $1 million parkway was he did not want that land to be industrialized. There were rail corridors on both sides, and where you have railroads, it's pretty easy to imagine you have factories as well, because before trucks, that was how you got things in and out. So that might well have been, even though it was a difficult site, with the steep bluffs there, a difficult site, but it was economically viable as a factory district. So the fact that it survived was due to sound public policy and citizen action as well. And that whole pattern, the North Avenue Dam, just south of North Avenue there, I think of that as sort of it's the hinge between two different worlds. And south of it, along what's now Commerce Street, that was dug for a canal that Byron Kilbourne had in mind that would have linked his settlement with New Orleans, basically. And he had a habit of making enemies, so that was pretty much stopped in its tracks when he had 1.25 miles done, got down to about the Schlitz Brewery. But it became a mill race for Milwaukee's first industrial district. So a lot of flour mills down there, tanneries, as those who've been around for a while, were on that mill race. So you have, before the Menominee Valley industrialized, it was the Milwaukee River below the North Avenue Dam, that was the industrial district. And that's why there are Polish settlements on the east side, right there on Humboldt and Brady. It's the old Polonia. They were there, and there was actually some open land between Yankee Hill and the Humboldt Brady area, because people were settling there to walk to work. The Polish settlement largely was industrial, and they walked to work down there on the Milwaukee River. So you have almost this Jekyll and Hyde kind of dichotomy: industry below the river and recreation above, going on at the same time. So it was really very, very much a split personality. And then what happened, obviously, the 30s is about when things began to bottom out in the upper river. And I recall talking to a resident of the East Side who said that she was still swimming in the Milwaukee River in the 1930s. There were swimming schools right above the dam, those Roans, Becksteins, and Whitakers. And I said the water must have been a little cleaner back then. She said, "Oh no, it was brown." so I mean, the 30s, you took your health into your hands, if you chose to swim there. So that, and also people have cars by then, now they're getting out into the country, even if they are of modest means. That was the river went downhill as rivers will do.
It wasn't just brown, it was smelly. One of the, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this already, but one of the features in the book that I like best is what we call community voices, which is a number of individuals from all kinds of situations who have contributed anecdotes or thoughts about their relationship to the river. And one of them is a lifelong resident of River West who remembers being in the river when it was in bad condition, or not in the river, but along the river. And he recounts a story about his uncle. It had gotten too bad for him to actually swim in the river by the time he was old enough to do that. But his uncle had swum in the river. And in his story, he describes how putrid the river really was. I mean, it smelled so bad, nobody wanted to be near it. So it went downhill in a very literal way. And it was a place people no longer wanted to go. Not just the river itself, but the beautiful land that we now revere along the river was shunned for many, many decades, actually.
And it wasn't just summer. This was winter recreation, as you said, a lot of ice skaters. But what happened was they used to skate from North Avenue all the way up to around Capitol Drive Mike Skorowski, the judge, his dad was raised in River West, George. He was a wonderful storyteller. And he said they used to have skating races from Locust down to North and back again. And then there was, I read an account, don't think I used it in the book, but said that was put to an end by the warm contributions of our sewers. So you didn't have ice. You didn't have ice. So that was kind of the end of that. And it was they used to have photograph in the book in the park section. They used to have a ski jump at Gordon Park on the west bank, and it was went all the way across the river. Milwaukee Magazine has a back pages feature this year, and I'm doing little kind of stories, little 200-word essays about them. And the first one was the Gordon Park ski jump. And they would kind of take off going pretty fast, and they would get all the way across the river and bang into a big pile of hay. So it was kind of, it took their lives into their hands. But they had to cancel that one year because the ice was so thin. And they were getting thousands of people to watch, that, and put all those folks on the ice, and worries about them caving in. So that was, it was a form of kind of almost like climate change applied to the river. It was no longer usable.
And this is a bit of serendipity, because the photograph that John is describing was one that I discovered independently by going to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, and I looking through to see what photographs I could find. And I find this picture of this ski jump and these thousands of people looking at the event and that sort of thing. And pretty much the next day, I find online a link to your picture in Milwaukee Magazine and a story about it. And it's one of my favorite archival pictures because it's so dramatic. And the picture I put near it in the book is a picture from essentially the same location in the park, and all you see is trees. You're looking through the trees in Gordon Park, across the river to the trees in Riverside Park. And at that time, if you look at the old picture, there aren't very many trees anywhere. And you see all these thousands of people on both sides of the river.
And I think that's another kind of lesson, the resilience of nature, the unstoppable vitality of nature. You think of our parks as always having been leafy and green. They weren't. They were as bare as any New Berlin subdivision back in the 50s. And in most cases, the best example is right over here. Lake Park, that was farmland, and there was a lighthouse on the bluff there near where the current one is back in 1855. That had to be rebuilt in time. That first was brick, then they built a metal one. And then as the tree plantings took place, and a guy named Christian Wall, a retired glue manufacturer, was the chief planter there. It's why Wall Avenue is named for him. So he would put a tree in the ground, and after every really big one, he'd have a glass of champagne. So he was a wonderful example for the kind of a father of the parks in a different way than Charles Whitnell. But what happened was, as those trees grew up, they blocked the light. So you have this beam of light kind of making this broad survey of Lake Michigan. The ships couldn't see it. So what they had to do was almost like a Polish flat. They took the first lighthouse office foundation and built a new superstructure and put the old one on top of the new one. So which is what you see today. So the parks, just that whole, kind of that sort of that green fuse, that goes on, has transformed areas that were denuded, by early white settlers.
And yet now, this many years later, some of you have been down there and hiked along. You can walk for miles, several miles, literally, under the trees, through in the shade, and both sides of the river. On the east side of the river, you can walk all the way from the old dam, the former dam, along the edge of the river for almost 8 miles without going across a street. You're going under bridges from one section of the Greenway to another, under Locust Street and under Capitol Drive, and under the last link just completed in 2018 was the connector trail between Estabrook Park and Lincoln Park that went underneath Port Washington Drive and the freeway. Unfortunately, that's closed right now. If you know what's happening to the freeway, they're rebuilding that bridge across the river at that location. So that section's closed. But when it reopens, you can once again hike from Silver Spring along, off-road trail, but then once you get to Estabrook Park, it's literally right next to the river on a riparian trail. You get to the dam, you can walk across and then continue down the river walk all the way down through downtown.
That's remarkable. I've not walked the whole stretch. I've walked the lower part of it. How many of you recall when the dam was drawn down? It was removed in '97, but it was drawn down before that. How many recall what those mud flats looked like? The mud flats right above the North Avenue Dam. When that lake was drawn down, it was shopping carts and tires and just all kinds of crud there. Just massive cleanup efforts. So what's remarkable is how fast nature recovers. And you're talking grasses and willows, things that are the pioneers that kind of come in. But before long, you've got the establishment of what's becoming a mature forest.
And the shopping carts and other debris that was so obvious is just the tip of a more intense iceberg, because in some sections of the river, there's toxic residues, especially behind the dam. So, and there's still at the North Avenue Dam, there's still some sediments that have been capped. If you go down there and you look close at some sections of that river down near the old dam, they're covered with what looks like concrete blocks. They're interlocking blocks and they're chain linked together. That's to cap what's underneath, which is still some residue sediments. But behind the Estabrook Dam, which came out more recently in 2018, a massive cleanup was undertaken to clean the river bottom of sediments containing toxic PCBs and other chemicals.
And where some of that comes from, you think of the pollution as being urban. There was a mercury marine plant up in Cedarburg, that did a lot of testing, and a whole lot of PCBs went into the river, into the sediment from there, as well as all the agricultural runoff. So this has been going on for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So how many of you have had the experience of walking a little way, just parts of the Greenway? I don't expect people to have walked the entire way. So the crowd has gotten bigger. So that's a good number. Does anybody have any questions from the audience now? We've
also use the Milwaukee for ice. They come up with these large saws and saw them with the blocks, and then they have ice houses area, and then they would have layers of sawdust. You can imagine that.
Yeah, the question was not so much a question as an observation that the Milwaukee River was not used simply for ice skating, but there was an industry there, this perpetually harvestable resource, as long as you had cold weather. So, and that was ice. And where the big ice houses were, they were on both sides of the river, pretty close to the North Avenue Dam. So it was where the water was deepest. And how they would cut this stuff was just fascinating. It was like plowing fields. They would scribe. They did not have lasers. They would scribe one straight line as much as they could. Then they'd have kind of a tracer to follow that. So they divide. The pictures are great. This checkerboard of ice squares or rectangles, and then they would use these heavy saws, a number of which ended up in the bottom of the rivers, antiques down there, and saw them out and kind of using these long pike poles, take them to the nearest riverbank to where the ice houses were, and they were conveyed by horsepower. A turntable basically that a horse, would be not going anywhere but moving steadily. That would kind of winch these things, kind of have this elevator kind of go up into the ice houses, and they would insulate it with sawdust. And you have all these millwork plants in Milwaukee, all the lumber mills in Milwaukee. So that was there was lots of sawdust back then, and that actually, Milwaukee being a brewing capital, that was an early advantage the first mechanical refrigeration in the breweries was 1880s or so. So it was decades before that time when you had to have natural ice. And the whole point was to try to have ice that would keep enough ice to keep the beer cool through the summer selling season until you could brew again in wintertime. And Milwaukee had an advantage over other German brewing centers like Cincinnati and St. Louis because we had real winters. You know, there it got hot really quickly. And if there was ice at all, it didn't last all that long. So it was a winter, say what you will about it, gave Milwaukee a competitive advantage during the heyday of brewing here.
And as we've talked about other things, there's nothing left of that at this point, except for one thing. The only remaining reminder that this happened is a trail known as the Beer Line Trail. And the Beer Line Trail runs along the former railroad line that carried ice in one direction from the Riverway and carried beer in the other direction out away from the breweries.
And one more reminder of that industry is it's right around Locust Street, but there's the remnants of a dam. You can't see it, but it's below the water line. And I was there a couple of years ago with my wife and my son, 3 of us in a canoe. Not a great idea in July. water gets fairly low, but we scraped over that, and I found out later that was one of the old. I think it was the
Schlitz, I believe.
Probably Schlitz.
Yeah. So that, one of the things I've learned in researching the book was there are things that are kind of mysterious, and you want to discover what they are. So there's this relatively famous only to people who know of it, but if you haven't been there, it's obviously not. But there's this tunnel in a section of the Greenway called Cambridge Woods that one of the contributors to the book is Carl Swanson, who wrote another book. His book is called Lost Milwaukee. And I've included one of his stories that's not in that book, in this book, and that's about this tunnel, and he calls it the tunnel to nowhere. And that's because if you go there now and you look in the tunnel, it dead ends where you think there should be daylight on the other side. And that's because there's no ravine anymore where there used to be a ravine, but it's now a tunnel that doesn't go anywhere. And there aren't records, according to him, maybe you know more about this story, but there are no records about why this was built. The speculation is that Schlitz, which owned property there, needed it for access to the river. Going underneath, that was another railroad. That was the railroad line on that side of the river. And so this tunnel to nowhere used to provide access to one of Schlitz's properties.
I didn't know that, Eddie, until I read the book. So that's not too far from the Hubbard Park Tunnel, right?
Hubbard Park, just south of Hubbard
Just south
Park,
of there, right?
between Hubbard Park and Locust Street. That's a section of, by the way, of the Greenway. For those of you who haven't walked, that side of the river is Cambridge Woods, and on the other side is Pleasant Valley, which we talked about. And both of those sections are the most untouched sections. They look untouched. Obviously, we talked about Pleasant Valley having been touched at one time, but currently they're left in a more natural state than most of the other sections. And so on either side of the river, you have this, you can imagine not being in the city anymore. And Cambridge Woods in particular has amazing wildflowers, especially in the springtime when the spring ephemerals are coming out. So I encourage you to take a walk at that time.
My lasting memory is the east side is, certainly is not manicured, but you got the oak leaf up there, then you have the walking trails a little lower down. And it's easier of access. And numerous times I've almost gotten hit by mountain bikers on the west side. And there's some sort of renegades there kind of using those paths, but look pretty challenging.
There is a tension in any place like this of different multi-users. It is technically illegal to ride or mountain bike, but that's unenforced. And so we find mountain bikers running up and down both sides of the river. And sometimes they conflict with the people who are walking their dogs or just hiking. And so there's this tension that happens in a place where you're trying to meet conflicting demands. People have different interests. And that's one of the challenges that a place like the Greenway has.
And speaking of conflicts, there are now beavers in the Arboretum near the Urban Ecology Center. I compared that to pyromaniacs in a fireworks factory. And it's kind of what's going on.
So I have, I think a related question from the Zoom chat, if you don't mind answering that. So Carolyn wanted to know, you were talking about earlier about how Central Park is trying for bulldozers and submissions, your words, and she wanted to know why that you're fortunate that that's happening, that's not happening in the Greenway. And I have another question from the chat that I think might speak to this, which is, can you talk about the revival of fish, birds, and fauna in Milwaukee?
One of the contributors to this book is Cheryl Nen, who is Milwaukee's riverkeeper. That's her title. That's also the name of the organization she works for. And she has done river monitoring for years, for many years. And the river, since the dam was removed and the water allowed to run freely, and the water has cleaned up considerably since then, we have gone from a very few species of fish behind what used to be the dam that were very tolerant of bad water to, I think the last count she said was 33 different species of fish. And there are fishermen out there all the time. I mean, if you're a fisherman, this is a very popular place, all the way up and down the 8 miles of this. I mean, there's hardly a time when you can go out there and you don't. I've been out there at all times and I've seen fishermen.
Yeah, so water quality is the big one, but also the access to the fish. When the dam came out in the 1990s, Will Warzan, who was the retired fishery specialist, he said above the dam there were only 3 species of fish, and they were all variations on goldfish. I mean, carp of some sort in that family. And now, as you said, 33, I've heard 40. So it's been a remarkable resurgence. The first part of that question, why do we escape the fate of Central Park? I would embrace that fate. That's a pretty nice park. But I think the obvious answer is that you're in the middle of Manhattan, so there's demand. So just the sheer fact of its existence is remarkable, when you have the price of the real estate in that part of the world. And I think in Milwaukee's case, there were other uses there. It was industry to the south and all the water attractions to the north. So there was already kind of a character in place, and then pollution came and no one cared anymore. So it was kind of there in not quite, but close to a benign neglect kind of a way, to be rediscovered as the water quality improved by a new generation of river lovers.
Don't get me wrong, I love Central Park. Central Park has a special place in the history of parks, but one of the stories told about Olmsted's design of Central Park is that he used more dynamite to create it than was used in the Civil War.
Yeah, so he embraced nature from a distance. Yeah, Linda.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that question. So her question is about the blue hole and can it be made more accessible? I love.
You know where it is, first of all.
I'm going to tell.
Oh, okay.
So I love the story about the blue hole. It's a former quarry. It's located about halfway between Capitol Drive and Port Washington Drive. And coincidentally, as we speak, I'm a board member of Preserve Our Parks, and we had a board meeting today at lunchtime. And one of our board members is a former employee of the Milwaukee County Park System, and he has designed the trail that's going along the west side of the river at that point, and it's called the Westabrook Trail. It's opposite East Estabrook Park. So it's called Westabrook Trail. And that trail is currently under construction. And so the Blue Hole is going to be much more accessible, to answer your second point first. But to get back to the Blue Hole itself, the story, it's a long story and I'll try to make it short, but are you familiar with the Blue Hole? Yeah. So the Blue Hole is one of two what you ended up being huge quarries. In the book, one of the chapters or one of the stories I mentioned starts with, if it weren't for the cement, I forget exactly how I phrased this, but if it weren't for the cement company, there might be no Estabrook Park. There was a massive cement mining and quarrying operation that took place on both sides of the river, and not only both sides of the river, but in the river itself, to quarry limestone out of the ground and make cement out of it. And the company that did this, Milwaukee Cement Company, became the largest cement producer in the nation at one point, just before the turn of the 20th century. And they've started mining and doing actual mines that went underground in Estabrook Park and created some sinkholes there. And on the west side of the river, they created these two quarries, and one of them has been filled in. It became a landfill for a while after they stopped quarrying, and then it was capped, and now it's a huge parking lot that's owned by MATC and used by MATC and UWM as a remote parking site. That used to be a quarry. The other quarry is now called the Blue Hole. And when it acquired the name some years ago, when it was kind of an attractive pond and kids would like to swim in it, but unfortunately it was dangerous to do that. So in Estabrook Park, they created in order to give kids an alternative to that and not have them create dangers for themselves by swimming in these conditions, they built a beach. They literally built a beach in Estabrook Park, which you can't see anymore. That doesn't exist anymore. And it was used until the river got polluted again. But that was because of this dangerous place called the Blue Hole.
Something surprised me. A geologist sent me an article he wrote for a geological journal. And the waterfall there, if you can place it just below where the beer garden is, you kind of go down the steps there, and there's a pretty good sized waterfall. You have to portage it, when you're canoeing. He said that was one of the rims of the quarry. So that's a man-made, a human-made attraction, which surprised me. I thought that was something that had been there from
that surprised me too. We've often described that the Estabrook Falls as the only natural falls in the river in this area, but it wasn't entirely natural at all. And I've kayaked, and I know you've canoed down it. You've wrote a story for the book that we used in the book.
We went around.
We went around it, and I've only ever portaged around it also. But I've seen people go right over the falls. In fact, I had the opportunity, just serendipity. You never know. You walk along the river. You're not sure what you're going to run into. One day, I was walking along the boardwalk. There's a boardwalk at the Estabrook Falls. Just below the beer garden in Estabrook Park. There's a stretch of boardwalk, and I was walking along there, and I noticed that upstream there were four fairly large rubber rafts coming downstream towards me, and I thought, these people are going to go over the dam. I can see that. So I waited for them. I mean, I wasn't entirely sure, but they in fact did. So I watched them as they did I say dam, over the falls. So they approach the falls, and they're all excited. And these are young folks. And the first one goes over, no problem. The second one, they kind of got tilted sideways. And you can see this in a photograph in the book that I took of this event. And they got sideways. And as they went over, the boat flipped right over. And they're swimming around in the water trying to upright the boat, and they drag it over to the side, dump out the water, and instead of getting back in and going on down, they portaged back up and did it again.
That's the spirit. The other rapids to run there, of course, is the one below the North Avenue Bridge. And that can be kind of, we took that in some high water. That can be a challenge.
It can be very challenging indeed. I find it a lot of fun.
Yeah, but it's fairly straight. No, there's no.
There is, and there is a certain class of kayakers who especially like to be there. You can see one picture of this happening in the book. They have these tiny little kayaks. I don't know how long they're, only about 6 feet long, and they sit in them kind of like a little bathtub, and they kayak out and they go against the current and they kind of ride the waves, because there's this strong current at that point and some what's called standing waves. They just sit the waves are always there. It's not like at the beach where they crash and change. So there's this standing wave, and these kayakers try to ride the waves and stay in position as long as they can.
So kind of stationary surfing.
Exactly. Exactly. Another question back in the back. Thank you. So the question is about stewardship, and what do we think the Greenway will look like in 50 to 100 years from now, and what will it take in terms of stewardship? That's a really important question, because a Greenway like this, it doesn't just happen, and it took a lot of effort by many parties to make it happen. But once it's there, it doesn't just stay either. It takes maintenance. And so there are many entities that are responsible for helping keep it as nice as it is. They include, of course, the property owners, the largest one being the Milwaukee County Parks Department. So they're responsible for maintaining their parks, as they do everywhere. And there are other villages. It's the city of Milwaukee, the village of Shorewood, and the city of Glendale who own properties along here. And there's also a number of private properties, and maintenance is shared, but there are also nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to stewarding. And the primary two are the Urban Ecology Center and my patron, the River Revitalization Foundation. So I was not hired because I wasn't being paid, but I've been serving as the artist in residence for the last 2 years for the River Revitalization Foundation. And they're located at the very southern tip of the Greenway. In fact, just south of the North Avenue Dam, the former dam site. They're right where the end of the Greenway literally becomes the downtown Riverwalk.
A former private home, right?
There were private, in fact, there was a private home that is their offices, but there was a fairly popular eating establishment known as Melinex Wheelhouse. Some of you may remember.
Dinner theater.
Dinner theater there, Mystery Theater. Yeah. And that they own it. That property was owned by the dinner theater for a while, and it was bought by the River Revitalization Foundation. And it's a small park; it's about 4 acres, but they tend it beautifully. But they also steward other parts of the Greenway, and there's a cooperative relationship, a partnership between these nonprofit organizations in the Milwaukee County Parks Department and others, where they are endowed with taking care of parts of the Greenway.
And I think backing up a bit in terms of what the Greenway might look like 50 years from now, my hope is that it looks like it does now with bigger trees and cleaner water.
Exactly. Well, and not just a hope, we can kind of expect that, because the Greenway didn't start 15 years ago. It's really started 150 years ago. I mean, and while there have been huge changes over that time, I think we can expect that the protections we put in place will last 50 years, and we can expect our children to enjoy this greenway. I think that's one of the nice legacies of the effort that's been made. I saw another, hey, yeah.
I'm just wondering if, and maybe both of you can do this, how was the river cleaned up when it was so polluted? And who was involved in the cleanup?
The first really bad answer is 1888, when Milwaukee, then it was the city, not the county, dug a tunnel underneath the east side, put the biggest water pump in the whole world in what is now Colectivo Coffee, and used the fresh lake water to flush the river. So that's how you sort of solved the problem, back in 1888. And the obvious downside was, where's all that filth going? Where do you get your drinking water? So it's people were dying of typhoid fever, back in the later 1800s. The more recent answer is this concerted effort of trying to control non-point pollution. The Deep Tunnel Project opened back in 1993, which had a huge impact, on overflows into that river. Before it had been an open sewer, and Milwaukee knew just what it was doing. There were, for the Built on Water book, there were headlines saying Milwaukee River to be one vast sewer. I mean, its only job was to transport waste, human, animal, industrial, to the river and then to the lake. So it was, in terms of our current understanding and our current mores, scandalous. Back then, it's all they had. They had no other choice. We weren't treating sewage until 1925, when the Jones Island treatment plant opened. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon.
And as I'm sure you're aware, this was hardly a phenomenon just for Milwaukee. I mean, this was problems for municipal urban areas throughout the country. Milwaukee, and because of the concern for dirty water all over the country, I mean, to answer your question, one of the driving forces for cleaning up the water was the Clean Water Act in 1972, and the Clean Air Act that followed. And that was a major impetus. Non-point pollution, as John mentioned. That means the pipes that come out of factories and deliver raw pollution, raw effluent into the river. Before then, that's all they had. We don't like that anymore, so we don't allow it anymore. And we can thank the Clean Water Act for that.
I sometimes think about what might have been the Chicago River. They reversed that, around 1900. And if they had not, can you imagine what the southern end of Lake Michigan would have looked like? All that pouring in, so there's still a lot of controversy, and, legal questions have lingered for a long time about Chicago's diversion of Great Lakes water down to the Illinois and then onto the Mississippi, which is the whole Great Lakes Compact. It's got that to make sure that didn't happen. It's been happening for over a century in terms of Chicago's use. But it was not a favor to the downstream communities in Illinois. But if that filth had been allowed to go to the southern end of Lake Michigan, we might have had a dead lake, from Sheboygan south. So, it's maybe that's kind of a somewhat mixed blessing.
And if you've read Dan Egan's books about the Great Lakes, Lake Erie there were times when Lake Erie had dead zones. So that easily could have happened to us. And both Chicago and Milwaukee now have deep tunnel systems in order to keep some of that from happening.
There was one story I found it and I couldn't find it again, but there's one story about the Chicago River being reversed. The stockyards, which were among the largest in the entire planet. All that stuff, would just go into they're called a bubbly creek, near the stockyards that would bubble because all this stuff is rotting, and then get into the sanitary and ship canal, on the Illinois River. There was one story about a gigantic hairball lodging against a river or a river bridge, someplace in sort of northern Illinois. Can you imagine that? All these cowhide. So it was colorful prose.
So we're getting a signal. I think it's closing time soon. One more question, maybe?
The AOC, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the area of concern cleanup, and the Milwaukee River estuary has been an area of concern. How many are there in the Great Lakes? 80, something like that, 60, something like that.
I don't know.
So it's EPA funding, Environmental Protection Agency, and the hope is they have made Milwaukee a priority, AOC. The hope is that they will fund over a period of not that many years a cleanup where they would suck up all the sediment in the bottom of the rivers, kind of the estuary itself, as well as the inner harbor. And the real toxic stuff, transport that to a safe landfill out of state. And the rest of it that's less toxic, there would be a new facility on the east side of Jones Island, above what's now they call Fisherman's Park, they sometimes call it, a little above where the ferry is, the Lake Express ferry. So I think that there have been no definitive decisions made yet, but the signals are good and the hopes are high. That's going to happen in the next few years.
And how that impacts the Greenway specifically is I mentioned the capped areas behind what used to be the North Avenue Dam that now have these concrete things covering them. That's scheduled to be cleaned up at some point. So that's, and if you enjoy, those of us who do enjoy walking along there now, there's going to be some huge changes to that because that's all going to be dug up and dredged and hauled away. So that will change again.
If you want a quick 10-minute introduction, there's a little video called A Toxic Legacy that was done. I did it for the sewers district. So just Google and go online and look up Toxic Legacy, and it'll give you kind of a very quick overview. I don't know how they did it. They got like 145,000 views so far.
I want to thank Daniel Golden again. I also want to thank John for joining me for this pleasant conversation. I want to thank the River Revitalization Foundation for supporting me as artist in residence. I'm also a board member of Preserve Our Parks, and I'd like to thank them for their support. And there are too many people to keep thanking, so I want to thank all the people who have been involved in this project. It's been a really wonderful thing to have been able to do. And I appreciate all of you for coming out tonight and sitting here and listening to us.
Buy the book, enjoy the river.
Books are available at the front desk. You can also order them online. Thank you all for coming. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. We'll be signing at the front of the store as well. Good night, everyone.